What is risk?
What is risk?
What do you think risk is?
¿Qué es riesgo?
What does risk mean to you?
Hi, I'm Ted Palmer, an air quality scientist with the United States Environmental Protection Agency. I've had the good fortune over the past 15 years to work with some of the nation's top scientists and engineers on many of the agency's most important risk characterizations. In a training class, through a series of informative videos, I'd like to give you a flavor as to what goes into a risk characterization. We're going to begin the training class by looking at what we call the world of risk. When I say the word risk, what does that mean to you?
When you say the word risk, I think about a negative or adverse event that might happen to a person, something that they may want to avoid or try to minimize.
If I said the word environmental risk, does that mean anything special?
Yeah, when I hear environmental risk, I think a lot more about some of the work that we do here that you and I have had a chance to do with the residual risk program, and really looking at pollutants and their effect on the environment and how that translates to human health risk or adverse outcomes that may happen to the population.
Great, thanks. Hey, Andrea, how are you? I have a quick question for you. When I say the word risk, what does that mean to you?
Well, Ted, to me, risk is the possibility of something bad happening because of a decision that I made. For example, I love to run, and I run all the time. But for me, running is a high-risk activity because every time I do it, I seem to get hurt. Right now, I'm battling an ankle injury because I've run too much.
Makes sense. If I said the word environmental risk, would that mean something different to you?
To me, environmental risk is very similar, only instead of the bad thing happening to me, the bad thing is happening to a group of people or to the environment based on decisions that us as humans make. For example, chemical manufacturers and people driving cars both cause pollution, but that pollution can be really detrimental to people living near it and to the environment.
Well, thanks. Take care of that ankle. Hey, Janice, take a breather for a second. How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Good. I'd like to ask you a quick question. When I say the word risk, what does that mean to you?
I guess I think about it as the probability of something bad happening. For instance, if I invest in aggressive stocks, I'm more likely to lose my money. Or if I'm running with scissors, I'm more likely to poke out an eye. Is that what you're talking about?
No, that's great. If I said the word environmental risk, would that mean something different to you?
Yeah, I would look at environmental risk from two different angles. One would be, what's the concentration of the toxic substance I'm being exposed to? And the other would be, what's my exposure to that concentration? So for instance, if I'm looking at pesticides in foods, I might try to eat more organic foods to cut down on my exposure to pesticides. Or if it's a really bad ozone or high PM day, I might not want to work out outside. I would come on in here to the gym and work out inside.
Great. Enjoy the rest of your workout. Thanks.
Sure. Talk to you later.
Hey, Kevin, mind if I interrupt? I know you're in a hurry. I'd like to ask you a quick question. If I say the word risk, what does that mean to you?
Oh, risk. I guess I think of the chance that something negative is going to happen.
If I expanded that and said environmental risk, would that mean something different to you?
Yes, environmental risk, I would think more about the impact that humans have on the environment, such as the water, the air, soil, things like that.
Great, thanks. Sorry to slow you down, bud. Hey, Rochelle. Sorry. If I say the word risk, what does that mean to you?
When I think about risk, I think about the dangers that we're exposed to on a daily basis, and they can be both seen and unseen. For instance, I can be on my way to work and be exposed to a sinkhole versus being a skydiver where you choose to live dangerously, or a risky business investor. So that's what I think about when you say the word risk.
If I said the word environmental risk, would that mean something different to you?
Environmental risk is a little different because when I think of that, I think of pollution immediately and the dangers that I'm exposed to on a daily basis from people driving their cars versus industry putting out pollutants from whatever products they're making. And I just want to know what kind of effect that they may have on my well-being and health. So I think about it in those kind of terms, whether it's impacting the drinking water, the air that I breathe, or the chemicals that I handle. That's what I think about when you say environmental risk.
Great, thanks. Enjoy the rest of your studying.
All right, thank you.
Let's begin our class by looking at the world of risk. What is risk? Well, I quickly Googled the definition, and if I looked at businessdictionary.com, this is the definition you get: a probability or threat of damage, injury, liability, loss, or other negative occurrence that is caused by external or internal vulnerabilities and that may be avoided through preemptive action. Well, that's risk in general. We all take risks every day in life. What's the risk of driving my car to work? What's the risk of flying in an airplane? If I was to smoke, what's the risk of something negative happening from smoking? Many of the risks we think of, we generally voluntarily decide whether or not to take those risks. There are also many risks that we involuntarily take a shot at. Many of the environmental risks that we will look at in this class fall into that category. Environmental risk can come from many different stages. Think of air pollution. That's a biological agent being released into the air. I don't have control over my air or what I breathe. Some physical stresses could be noises that we hear in the background somewhere that might affect our hearing. Some of the physical stresses could be voluntary, like listening to loud music at a rock concert. But basically, environmental threats are involuntary type threats. So let's look at a conceptual diagram to kind of see how we can start to begin to see what environmental threats are. And when we look at this diagram, I'm overwhelmed by the number of boxes and colors. Well, if we look at it quickly, we say, what is beginning? What is causing that threat? These are what we call stressors. The stresses could be many different things. They can be air pollution. They could be, like we said, noise pollution, or other changes to the environment. The stressors aren't a threat unless they come in contact with a person. The people are what we call receptors. These receptors can also be environmental impacts. It might not just be people, it could be birds and bees and bugs and trees and whatnot. And how it gets from that stressor to the receptor is what we call our pathway or our exposure assessment. These exposure assessments can take many shapes and forms. It could be a different pathway each time for each stressor. It could be air, it could be soil, it could be water. And then finally, the endpoint, or what is the effect of that stress, is what we call our endpoint. And this is the health outcomes. So hold on. That conceptual diagram was way too complicated. In this class, we're going to focus on just a few things. We're going to focus on human health. We're going to focus on air toxics. And we're going to focus on the risks to the general population. We're not going to focus on occupational studies. We'll leave that up to the OSHA folks. So let's look at our diagram now. Our conceptual model becomes much simpler. Our stressors now, air pollution. In this case, air toxics. Our receptors could be general populations, or it could be susceptible populations, such as the elderly or the young. Or it could be environmental justice communities. Our endpoints, in this case, would be cancer and non-cancer risks. But even this flow diagram is a little too complicated. So let's try to simplify it just a little bit more by looking at simple pictures at really what we think is going on in the environment. Well, our stressor in this case is air pollution. Air pollution generally has to come from a source. It could come from a big factory. It can come from smaller sources, such as gas stations and dry cleaners. We generally call these area sources. And in many cases, it can come from mobile sources. Cars burn gasoline. Or your lawnmower is actually a mobile source. So mobile sources, area sources, and major sources We'll cover those as our primary emission points in this risk class. But once it's released into the atmosphere, pollutants just don't sit there. They get dispersed and move in the atmosphere. What causes them to move and get dispersed from its source of origin? Well, basically meteorology and the wind and the turbulence in the atmosphere. And slowly as that pollutant gets transformed downwind, it could get changed shapes. It can turn into different chemical species through sunlight and other photochemical reactions in the atmosphere. It could come in contact with clouds. And then when that happens, it can get washed out and rain down to the ground. And then what happens once that pollutant gets in contact with the ground? It could come in contact with trees and animals and other biota that might be out there. In fact, the pollutant get washed off into a stream or into a river or into a lake and get taken up by fish or the wildlife that's in the lake. And we call this type of pathway a multi-pathway, where the pollutant can bioaccumulate down into the river or into the water. In this class, we'll just touch upon that pathway, but we'll primarily be concerned with the air pathway. What happens when that pollutant gets transferred downwind and comes in contact with people? People breathe it in. It becomes available to get absorbed into their skin. These are many ways, the three different primary ways that this pollutant can transform into somebody: through inhalation, through dermal, or through ingestion. Once the pollutant is available to the person, or they're exposed to the pollutant, it now gets uptaked into their body. And once it's in their body, it gets metabolized and absorbed and can get distributed through their bloodstream to many different organs. Once it gets to these organs, the possibility of negative consequences is there. It can result in cancer, or it could result in non-cancer, such as respiratory or neurological disorders. While this picture is pretty, and it gives us a nice big view of what's going on in the real world, it doesn't tell us what's the possibility of risk. Many times when we think of risk, like I said earlier, taking a ride in my car, flying in an airplane, we think of risk mainly as a gut feeling. I think I'll be okay. How many times have you said that in your life? Probably many. You're taking a wild guess based just purely on your feelings of what you think the risk is. Well, fortunately, we have a much more formal approach to trying to quantify and qualify what those risks might actually be in the real world. So what is risk assessment? One possible definition was developed by the National Academy of Sciences over 30 years ago and is used by many federal agencies, including the EPA today. They define risk assessment as human health risk assessment is the process of using the factual base of information to define the health effects of exposure of individuals or population to hazardous materials and situations. So in that picture we just looked at, we can start to begin to look at some of that factual information as to what those emissions were. What type of emissions were they? What are the chemical properties of those emissions? We could start to look at the health effects of the people. What's the effect of exposing someone to a certain concentration or exposure concentration? And we can come up with a probability of the risk actually occurring. Before we do any risk assessment, it's always good to step back. Why are we even doing this risk assessment? And the first question we're always asked is this risk significant? Well, it depends on who's asking the question. And many times that person is a risk manager. Now in this class we don't intend to go into risk management, but it's always important to understand the question being asked before you come up with the answer. Is the question you're asked in response to a regulatory consideration? Perhaps it's a public health consideration you're looking at, or other social factors going on. All these factors must get weighed into your risk assessment. So a risk assessment really is comprised of the exposure assessment we talked about, which was the fate and transport and getting that pollutant to the person we're talking about and being uptaked into the body, making it available, And then finally, the toxicity assessment, where the pollutant is uptake by the organs and a negative occurrence could possibly occur. The risk characterization will answer this question for the risk manager. So let's go on to the next module in this class to begin to find out how we perform a risk characterization.